This is a fictional mindbender. I did a video recently on the connection between the 10th Doctor and the Valeyard incarnations via the episode Waters of Mars. And while I still stand by what I said about that episode and its point, it also at the same time opened up some doors regarding what I shall refer to as the fall of the 10th Doctor. Now, what do you mean by fall, you may ask? Am I referring to what I spoke about in the earlier video? Well, partially yes, but not entirely. The fall of this version of the Doctor doesn't involve him going Valeyard mode or going evil like the Master, per se. Rather, it's his fall from grace as not only the heroic Doctor, but also the wandering Doctor from his previous and later incarnations. What makes the 10th Doctor so interesting to me is looking back on it now, seeing how he became at the height of his reputation and then how he degraded from that. Specifically, the Doctor was always compassionate and caring, even with a bit of a temper and some ego, depending on which version you dealt with. But he still was, for the most part, willing to help out others, while at the same time being somewhat aloof and mysterious while he was at it. In this, the 10th was no different. But he also begins to leave that aloofness behind, as it were, as he begins to work more in depth with others like Unit and Torchwood, as well as found family. And let's not even get into potential relationships. He is, in essence, becoming less mysterious and now more renowned as the heroic figure he's known for. Yes, he's lonely and still has PTSD over the time more, but his heroicness always shone through. What changes, though, is that he slowly starts to become more self-centered, more given to his flaws as his fame, if you will, increases. For example, when he flees to England and hides his Time Lord essence in a locket to hide from a species that's hunting him down to gain immortality, called the Family of the Blood. And while making his then companion, Martha, literally become the unknown caretaker of this new personality, John Smith, insightful, that inhabits his body. Yet this plan fails, getting people killed, and also ends up calling upon John Smith, who has formed a fully independent life from the Doctors, to sacrifice his personality so that the Doctors can return and defeat the Family of the Blood that's hunting him down. And John's lover hates him for this and calls the Doctor out for it by calling him a coward, because that fake persona was willing to give up his life to save others while the Doctor was not. Biased as it was, she was also right. What I mean by that his lover was right is that while John confronted the evil that was affecting his society, the Doctor ran from it and hid from it, in deliberately endangering others so that he didn't have to deal with it, and only dealt with it when he was finally forced to. No matter how righteous his wrath was afterwards, the damage was already done. Now, the 10th becomes increasingly unaware of the immediate effect and risk he puts on those around him during his time, and what they're going through. Primary examples being Rose and Martha, and that he becomes so grief-stricken from falling for Rose and then essentially losing her to another version of himself, mind you, that he is oblivious that this new companion he has with him has also fallen in love with him, until she finally tells him before leaving him. And then this continues in that when he partners up with Donna Noble, and although he's straightforward with her about no romantic entanglements, which she wholeheartedly agrees, she still later on takes on Time Lord regenerative properties from his severed hand to essentially become a Time Lord herself for all intents and purposes. And thus, the Doctor, in order to supposedly try and save her life, forcefully removes the essence and any memory of him from her mind. To save her life, he says to her grandfather, but also completely ignoring the critical split-second moment when she said flat out that she wanted those experiences and memories despite the knowledge of her oncoming death that would come from that, despite the overload essentially. The 10th Doctor violated her individual rights and agency and this arguably is the most controversial action of any of the Doctor's incarnations that he's ever done, including the War Doctor, in my opinion. And as a side note, I think this is also nicely addressed as well by the 12th Doctor and his companion, Clara Oswald, when they find themselves in a similar situation. Only, he recognizes that he's repeating the same mistake that his 10th incarnation did, with help from Clara, of course, knowing what he's doing, and gives her the choice. Now, Waters of Mars does take this to the line, and he becomes the most self-centered and arrogant that he's ever been, as I mentioned in the other video. Yet, even though he does pull back from the brink thanks to Adelaide Brooks' death, the tendency is still there. The weakness, if you will, is still there. All the Doctor's incarnations have flaws, but what makes this different is that none of those flaws involved a grandiose view of the Doctor's own self-importance. Or, put it another way, like the Valeyard. Even the 11th Doctor, threatening to execute the gunslinger in the episode A Town Called Mercy, was rooted in saving others from the evil that he kept allowing to reoccur, rather than on his own greatness or asserting his dominance. And perhaps the 11th Doctor's self-hatred comes from what happened with the 10th, knowing how far he had fallen and could fall again if he was not more careful. And I think this is why, in universe, that Time was telling the 10th Doctor that he had to go. The 10th Doctor needed to go because where his earlier and later incarnations could resist the temptations of personal glory and self-importance and vanity, this version could not, and I would argue would have eventually fallen anyway. Something he didn't fully understand, I think, until his final confrontation with Rassilon, and that he almost sacrificed his last companion, Wilfred, just so he didn't have to regenerate. At the time, I thought this was kind of cruel because of the position that Time basically put him in, to choose basically, his life or Wilfred's life. But now that I think about it, I think it was perfectly fair and the right thing to do because it forced the 10th to at last look in the mirror at what he had been running from. And it wasn't his death, but rather the growing amoral monster he was slowly becoming, even against his own will. The Doctor in all his incarnations has always been kind of looked up to by people around him. But at the same time, he was always still essentially mortal, even if he was a greatly long-lived mortal. That being said, he's therefore also beholden to the same flaws and mistakes that mortals make. But the problem that he's always exposed to at some point is that if you live long enough, you don't just run into yourself, as a Doctor frequently does, but also you start to come to think that you can't make any mistakes, that you have somehow elevated yourself to a position that is above others. It's natural. It's a hierarchy. It naturally happens to most people in that position, and it happened to the 10th Doctor. As I said earlier, all the other incarnations of the Doctor were able to resist this and just not have to deal with that. But for whatever reason, perhaps because of the fact that he was becoming more popular, as it were, and he was working more often with others and people were falling for him left and right, perhaps this played a part in his inability to resist that temptation. But what do you guys think? Do you think the 10th Doctor was going to fall at some point if he had not regenerated? Let me know in the comments below. But this is the Fictional Mindbender, and you guys have a good day.